John. In 2012, Secretary Clinton's final year as Secretary of State, federal lobbying records show that a leading defense contractor hired a trio of lobbyists to lobby the Department of State for a larger share of foreign military sales contracts by which, as you know, advanced weapons systems are shared with other countries. The federal lobbying records show that all three of those lobbyists were large donors or bundlers for Hillary Clinton in both her 2008 and 2016 campaigns. Among those lobbyists was Heather Podesta, whose brother-in-law that year was John Podesta, who that year was serving as a counselor at the Department of State for approximately $130,000 a year, and also a member of a policy advisory board that Secretary Clinton created. As it happened, the gambit appeared to have worked because that defense contractor's share of foreign military sales contracts surged in 2012, with 3 contracts alone for provision of advanced systems to Qatar, totaling for that firm some $19 billion in contracts. Even if no laws were broken, it would seem a fairly cozy situation, would it not?
Well, thanks, James. What I would tell you is that there's a standard procedure here for how contracts are considered, vetted, and decided on. And if you'll allow me, I'll just walk through a little bit of that.
Please.
Each request is assessed on its own merits, on a case-by-case basis, in accordance with the Arms Export Control Act and the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy, and based upon ongoing defense cooperation engagements by both the Department of Defense and the Department of State with foreign counterparts. Each request from a partner nation must be reviewed and approved by several bureaus within the Department of State and the Department of Defense, which all must generally come to a consensus before recommending approval. So then, as required under the Arms Control Export Act, proposed major sales or transfers must be briefed and formally notified to Congress. These decisions are based on a pretty comprehensive interagency process that's pretty rigid, too. It's not just something that any one official here at the State Department can say, yeah, let's go ahead and do it. And the other thing is they're based solely and completely on the foreign policy objectives of the United States of America, and nothing else factors into that.
Statutorily, one official here at the Department of State is entrusted with final approval over these transfers. Am I correct about that?
Well, obviously, the ultimate responsibility, of course, rests on the cabinet official. In this case, it would be the Secretary of State. At DOD, it would be the Secretary of Defense. But they both have to be in concurrence here.
My understanding is State approves these transfers or contracts, Defense implements them. Am I wrong about that?
You're not wrong, but you're not completely right either. Obviously, the Foreign Military Sales Program is a State Department program, but we do it in close coordination with DOD. Having been in that world, I can assure you that DOD certainly gets a vote. And if there are disagreements between the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, those are ironed out at that level. So we don't move forward with foreign military sales contracts unless everybody's on board with it, that there's a true interagency development. But yes, who quote-unquote signs off on the final sale? Obviously, it's the Secretary of State. That's the way it's enshrined in law. But that doesn't mean that there's no coordination or no requirement to make sure we've got a consensus view going forward. So I think we need to be careful when we say there's one person who makes this decision. While there's one person who has final sign-off, that one person can't do it without a whole body of evidence and analysis and review and interagency consensus before they get to that point.
What we have here is a situation in which a trio of lobbyists who have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Hillary Clinton's campaigns and earned hundreds of thousands of dollars lobbying her State Department on behalf of this defense contractor, succeeded in securing contracts for that contractor that were far and above what they had received in previous years. And indeed, that contractor, after Secretary Clinton left office, essentially discontinued its lobbying relationships with those lobbyists. So the appearance, John, is akin to one of those pop-up stores that materializes just to sell Halloween candy or July 4th fireworks for a seasonal need, and after that seasonal need has been met, vanishes.
Well, I'll let you speak to the appearances, James. I mean, that's more your job than mine. I can only speak to process, and I certainly can't speak to the decision-making, years ago in terms of each and every contract. I wouldn't do that. What I can assure you, though, is that we remain confident in the system and the process that's in place, and the very judicious manner in which contracts or foreign military sales that are dependent upon certain contracts are executed. There is a very lengthy, rigorous, sometimes painfully slow. In fact, many of our partners complain about that.
It wasn't in this case.
Well, again, sometimes painfully slow, that is done across the board. There are the only considerations that are factored into the foreign military sales program is the furtherance of foreign policy objectives of the United States of America, and not the efforts by external groups to lobby, as you say, or to influence that decision. The decisions are made, again, across the interagency and only in furtherance of our foreign policy objectives.
One last question. You've been very kind. Throughout your answers to mine and others' questions today, you have frequently relied on your personal knowledge of how things work at this agency and the Pentagon as well. So I'm going to ask you in that vein to tell me, should we imagine that at a time when John Podesta was a salaried counselor here, this very man who wound up as Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman and who is much in the news these days, should we imagine at the very time that John Podesta was a salaried counselor here, Secretary Clinton would have been unaware that her department was being lobbied by Mr. Podesta's sister-in-law?
I cannot answer that question. I do not know. I would refer you to.
But you
the
know how
former
thing work.
secretary.
You're all too frequently telling us you know how things work.
But I don't know what former Secretary Clinton was aware of in terms of Mr. Podesta's relatives and the jobs that they were doing at the time. I couldn't possibly speak to that. What I can assure you, though, is, and you know, James, you've been around long enough. You know what the Foreign Affairs Policy Board does. And yes, Mr. Podesta was a member of the board at the time. I can assure you that his role on the Foreign Affairs Policy Board played absolutely no role in this or any other foreign military sales program. That's not the objective of the board. That's not their purview, and that he would, as a member of the board, have no role in that, none whatsoever.
Thank you.
You're welcome.